Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode on the New Books Network. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Miranda Melcher, and I'm very pleased today to be speaking with Dr. Alissa Klots about her book titled Domestic Service in the Soviet Union, Women's Emancipation and the Gendered Hierarchy of Labour, published by Cambridge University Press in 2024. This book is really the first to explore the evolution of domestic service in the Soviet Union, which is a really interesting concept to think about, and as we will, talk about. The idea that domestic service is very much still in existence through much of the Soviet Union, despite the whole Bolshevik egalitarianism thing going on. We're going to get into that. There's a lot to talk about here, in fact. So, Alissa, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Could you please start us off by introducing yourself a little bit and tell us sort of why you decided to write this book? What questions are you asking in it? How did you develop them? What's the sort of backstory here?
Well, the backstory is a little less intellectual, I would say. After I finished my undergrad in Perm State University, I'm originally from Perm, Russia. I just got an office job and got very bored very quickly. And as I met with some of my friends who were in graduate school at the time, they said, you should start writing a dissertation for fun. And that's what I did. I found an advisor, Galina Alexandrovna Yankovskaya at Perm State University. And I was like, I want to write a dissertation. She was like, great. But I had no idea what exactly I wanted to do. So she just suggested this topic to me. Why don't you write about domestic service, particularly at that moment in Stalinist Soviet Union? I said, sure, I think I can do that. But of course, I knew nothing about it. And because I wasn't formally enrolled in a graduate program, I just did it for a couple of years as a hobby. I went to a library every Sunday to read Soviet newspapers and get a sense what domestic service was about. And as I was working on this topic, I started thinking about the paradox that you mentioned in the introduction. How did the phenomenon of paid domestic labor, kind of the quintessential exploitation, survived for so long in the Soviet society? And as it became obvious for me while I was reading the newspaper articles, that it was not something that was hidden, not something that existed but ignored by the Soviet state, but something that was recognized as part of a socialist economy. So as I continued working on this topic, I realized I need to do some sort of formal graduate training, and I applied for a program at Rutgers University. And I worked there with Professor Johann Hellbeck on my dissertation that broadened the chronological framework for the research, because I understood that you really need to start at the very beginning. Why the Bolsheviks decided to let paid domestic labor continue and how it all came to an end. And that eventually became the foundation of my book that I continued working first at the European University in St. Petersburg, then as a postdoctoral fellow at Tel Aviv University, and finally here at the University of Pittsburgh.
Thank you for telling us about that origin story and the questions it led to. It makes me want to ask particularly about the sources you've used to investigate this. I mean, you mentioned kind of being in libraries and reading newspapers, but can you tell us more about the kind of material you used and what time period you decided to cover? And both of these obviously required some decision making about the sources and the time scope. So what were you doing on both of these fronts, and how did you make these decisions?
Right. So with a topic like domestic service, you really can't be too picky with your sources. My approach from the very beginning was I want to work with anything I could find. But finding, of course, the material seemed to be the hard part. So the first revelation came as I started reading newspapers that there's quite a bit about paid domestic labor in just regular Soviet newspapers from kind of the main Soviet publication like Pravda and Izvestia and Trud. But then I also realized that there were some booklets and brochures that were published specifically focusing on domestic service. So that was kind of my starting point, something that I could find at libraries in Russia. Then, of course, the archives. And this is something that I think is particular to doing research in the Soviet Union. The Soviet archives are very structured. So my main source were labor union archives. Most workers in the Soviet Union belonged to a labor union that was, of course, not an independent labor union, but very much of the part of the Soviet labor management system. And because this union system was hierarchical, the central committee would have a lot of materials pertaining to, not just decision making in the center, but also to what was going on in different parts of the country. So I started working in the archives by going to the state archive and looking at the central committee documents for the unions to which domestic workers belong throughout Soviet history. Now, those collections weren't complete. There were some parts that were missing, particularly the pre-war period was missing. The documents were just lost during evacuation during World War II. And so I realized also that I needed to go kind of to a more local level. So I did research in city archives in Moscow, St. Petersburg, former Leningrad, and in my hometown of Perm, where I was actually able to recover some of the central committee documents from the late 30s as they were sent down the chain. And I was also very interested in the kind of general representation of domestic labor. So I tried to, compile lists of films, books, short stories, anything really that had a character that would be a domestic worker. Just to get a better sense of how these discussions were had outside of the kind of labor management community. And finally, I think the biggest challenge was trying to figure out how all of that functioned at the level of families, because that is something that is hard to get at if you just look at documents produced by state unions. And here I relied on, first of all, memoirs, and you can find a lot of mentions of domestic workers in Soviet intelligentsia memoirs. But also I conducted about 25 interviews. More than half would be with former employers of domestic workers, but a smaller proportion would be with women that had experience being domestic workers themselves. And these, to me, were, of course, the most fascinating stories.
That is a very interesting range of sources. Could you just explain the time period you cover because of the sources?
Well, the time period that I cover is really the history of domestic service in the Soviet Union, because, I started in 1917. I look at the pre-revolutionary kind of trends and ideas to just see where the Bolsheviks were coming from and what were the kind of general views held about domestic service among progressive intelligentsia. But then I continue into the late 50s, early 60s, because this is kind of the tail end of domestic service as a mass phenomenon in the Soviet Union. I should probably note that I mostly focus on domestic workers in the homes of privileged members of Soviet society, but not members of the very kind of elite circle of Politburo members and the like. So I'm not looking at those who worked for Stalin or Khrushchev, but I'm more interested in kind of the mass phenomena of domestic labor. If you look at the censuses throughout the 20s and 30s, the numbers are a little sketchier for the post-war period, but based on what I have seen, the number is pretty constant. There's about 500,000 domestic workers registered in the censuses. So these are the main protagonists of my book. And so even though some families would still have some sort of maids, nannies, any other kind of domestic workers in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that would be more like exceptionally privileged families in Soviet society. The mass phenomena really existed until kind of the early 60s. So that really gave me a clear understanding where I should start and end the book.
Yeah, no, that's definitely helpful to understand. Starting then with that beginning, obviously the Bolsheviks come into power with a whole bunch of different ideas that, it's one thing to have lots of ideas before you're in power and then figuring out what that means once you are in charge. Thinking about domestic labor specifically, what were the different sorts of ideas and attitudes that the Bolsheviks came into power with, and to what extent were they already quite contradictory?
Well, the Bolsheviks didn't really spend that much time thinking about domestic service specifically, not to the same degree, of course, how they thought about how we're going to redistribute land or how we're going to, create the government. But they had ideas about labor, and they had ideas about women, and they had ideas about class. And those were kind of the foundations of the approaches that the Bolsheviks developed in the 1920s regarding paid domestic labor. So in the late imperial society, domestic servants were often seen, especially by progressive intelligentsia, as the most exploited, the most backward part of the society. And that, on the one hand, implies sympathy, but on the other hand, it really implies some kind of a paternalistic approach. So they weren't really seen as members of a revolutionary class. Moreover, if we look at the general kind of Marxist approach to paid domestic labor, if we look at Marx specifically, for example, Marx's writing, which is really a few lines, the domestic servants were seen as really remnants of an older feudal society, or sometimes he would call them white slaves, because they didn't really represent the working class. They were not part of the capitalist production. And even though Marx doesn't say that specifically, you would see, you can imagine or infer from the writing that domestic service is not compatible with the kind of progress of history. This is something from the past. This shouldn't remain for the future. And so these ideas about domestic workers as passive victims of capitalism, not really members of the revolutionary proletariat, were really important if we want to understand where the Bolsheviks were coming from.
Yeah, that's definitely. Sorry, please go ahead.
Yeah. Another important component here is Bolsheviks' attitudes toward household labor. The Bolsheviks, as we know, really imagined socialist society in which household labor would be collectivized. It will be removed from the private household and will be performed outside the home. They were mostly talking about housewives, right? The women will be liberated from the drudgery of housework, which itself is really significant, that the Bolsheviks really saw housework as drudgery, not as a kind of a useful contribution to society, not something anyone could enjoy. And so, removing housework from the home really meant that there won't be any housewives or domestic workers. Again, this is kind of the foundation of what would become the policy of the Bolsheviks. But things changed right before the Bolsheviks come to power, mostly because of the events of 1905, the first Russian Revolution, where the Bolsheviks were surprised to discover that domestic workers are in some way a revolutionary force, because Russian domestic workers, the first domestic workers in history, as some commentators noted, actually went on strike and joined other workers in their protests and formed unions. So that, the agency that domestic workers exhibited in 1905 made the Bolsheviks become more attentive to them as a constituency. And something to remember is that a significant number of working women in Russian cities were domestic workers. So you can see some of the inclusion of domestic workers in the potential consistency for revolutionary agitation right before 1917, kind of in this period between 1905 and 1917. But that was definitely the reaction to the fact that domestic workers took an active part in the Russian Revolution of 1905.
That's definitely a helpful change to understand going into the Bolsheviks being in power. Once they're in power, though, rather a lot changes very quickly, right? So the immediate taking over of power, then there's war communism, then there's the new economic policy. That's a lot of change in not very many years. And the ideas of kind of what a good Bolshevik is also changing as a result of that. So if we think about the 1920s, could a good Bolshevik employ a servant? What do ideas of domestic workers look like in this environment?
Well, that's a very good question. And a lot of Bolsheviks didn't have an answer to that question, whether or not a good Bolshevik could have a servant. Because on the one hand, we have those persistent ideas that domestic service is quintessential exploitation, that, as Marx said, that they're, paid domestic labor is a remnants of even a pre-capitalist period. And of course, a lot of members of the party were really suspect of the whole practice. Now, at the same time, it became clear very quickly that, yes, it's a great plan to collectivize housework, but it's not something that the Bolsheviks could do right away. In the meantime, somebody has to cook, take care of the children, clean the house. So somebody had to perform those tasks within the household. And the more women, particularly within the party, would become involved in production or in party work, the more the question of who's going to do the housework became more and more urgent because, of course, the Bolsheviks didn't have an alternative plan to collectivization. Even though some leaders, like even Lenin and Kollontai, mentioned that men should help women with housework, lend them a hand, it was never part of the Bolshevik program to redistribute labor within the home. In other words, the Bolshevik did reimagine the place of women in the new society, right? These are the women who work, women who participate in political life, but they didn't reimagine the role for men. The men were never expected to do the housework on par with women, while the new state was, getting their act together to collectivize housework. So on the one hand, some people are very uncomfortable with the persistence of paid domestic labor, which, of course, in the 1920s wasn't that shocking because there were other elements of capitalist and market society that persisted that was part of the new economic policy that Lenin introduces after the end of the Civil War. And there are other forms of private employment in the 1920s. But there is this discomfort around the presence of servants in the households of particularly the Bolsheviks. And so we see a shift around, 1925, I would say, kind of mid-1920s, when the party makes more or less a conscious choice to really emphasize the role that domestic workers play in freeing the labor of more qualified women who could become, party activists or union activists or work in production, while the domestic workers, who were mostly migrants from the countryside, often illiterate and literally having no skills, they couldn't perform this more valuable labor. So it made sense in the situation where you don't have resources to collectivize housework, to have these less qualified women take on housework in order to liberate the labor of these more qualified women.
Yeah, I think there's some of those contradictory ideas really coming up when sort of it looks like, oh, wait, we actually have to do things now. Hang on, how does that work, right? As you said, the role for women was reimagined, but not for men. If we think then about the fact that there is this continued reality of domestic workers in this Soviet system, were they protected, for example, by Soviet law in this period of sort of the 1920s, early 1930s?
I think this is what makes the Soviet case so interesting today. As we're still struggling to figure out what to do with paid domestic labor, how do we protect household workers? It's quite a recent development that we have countries really trying to enforce laws that would protect the work of domestic workers. And so I think it's really instructive to look at the Soviet Union, the first country to recognize housework as labor and recognize domestic servants as workers. And I mean, you can look at it as a more of ideological shift. Even the change in the words, right? It's no longer domestic servants, because of course there are no servants in the Soviet Union, but these are domestic workers, emphasizing that now we have only the proletariat, no servants. But it wasn't just a change in words. Domestic workers were recognized as workers, and initially the labor code applied to them, the first Soviet labor code of 1918, applied to them just like any other workers. But by the mid-1920s, it became clear for the party leadership and the union leadership that domestic workers needed a special law that would tailor to their particular type of work, particular type of employment. Now, the law that was introduced in 1926, on the one hand, took away a lot of the rights that domestic workers had as just part of the proletariat under the 1918 labor code. Most importantly, domestic workers were no longer entitled to an 8-hour work days. So according to labor code, whatever you work beyond the 8-hour work days, you then receive compensation for overtime. Domestic workers were no longer entitled to this overtime compensation. Their amount and the hours they were to work were were to be specified in their labor contract, which of course, on the one hand, is a step back compared to the original approach where domestic workers were treated just like any other workers. But at the same time, this law was still the most progressive types of legislation for 1920s. If we look globally, no other domestic workers had the kinds of protections that Soviet domestic workers have. No other domestic workers had at least the right for paid time off, vacation. Their employers had to make insurance contributions. So in the case of unemployment or disability, domestic workers were entitled to compensation. Now, of course, we're talking about the 1920s, where the country was suffering from very high unemployment, and women, as we know, were the first ones to be fired and the last ones to be hired. So the compensations that domestic workers often received were meager. Their salaries were very low. But again, if we look at this law and in general the Soviet approach to domestic workers in the 1920s, it was uniquely progressive in the way the Soviet state tried to protect the rights of domestic workers. And there was, in fact, an institution in charge of overseeing employment of paid domestic workers in the 1920s. That was Narpit. That was the union of, it included different kinds of workers in food services, but domestic workers were really the largest contingent within our pit. So having the legislation and having a kind of a state organ that was responsible for overseeing the implementation of this kind of legislation, that was very important. Now, I would say, of course, that ultimately, if there was a labor conflict, domestic workers would go to the union, to a conflict resolution committee, where, especially in the first half of the 1920s, they were likely to get what they were asking for, because union activists were kind of biased towards domestic workers, because they saw them, first of all, as workers, as members of the union. But as kind of the decade progressed, and especially if domestic workers were to go to courts, if the situation wasn't resolved at the union level, they were less successful in getting all their demands met. Now, of course, this is the situation where really the kind of the biases of the people who make those decisions were really important. If you believe that domestic workers are workers and workers are, always right in a dictatorship of the proletariat, then of course, you're more likely to award the compensation for the worker. And most of the conflicts were really about, the compensations once the domestic worker left the job. But at the same time, you also have the situation when both the employer and the domestic worker appear to be members of the proletariat. And then the situation becomes difficult because, housework is something that happens within the confines of a private home. So there's really very little oversight of, how many hours the worker really worked and how much money the worker really received. So in those situations, the judges and members of the union who were overseeing this the case would be more cautious to meet the demands of the domestic workers. So really the understanding of class was significant, and it was really the defining aspect of the way that the domestic workers were protected. If they were seen more proletarian than their employers, they were more likely to get what they were asking for. If both the employer and the employee were seen as members of the working class, then the judges would be less inclined to award what the domestic worker was asking for. But just overall, I think with all the caveats for the 1920s, that was really the first state in which domestic workers had this pretty comprehensive set of rights as workers.
Yeah, no, that's definitely very interesting to understand. And of course, the role of the union in that is key. Can you tell us about some of the other ways that the union was involved in the lives of these workers and the way these workers kind of thought about themselves, I suppose? Was the union sort of universally welcomed by domestic workers? I mean, what did that look like beyond these courts and judgments?
Well, the transition from being a domestic servant to being a domestic worker really entailed what the Bolsheviks would call the awakening of class consciousness. And that, I would argue, was the second, or in some ways, even the first task for the union, to turn servants, the servile women, the backward women, into conscious workers who are entitled to rule the state under the dictatorship of the proletariat. And here I'm referring to a very popular slogan that you can see throughout the 1920s, especially, that every kitchen maid can rule the state. The idea here being that any backward member of the society can be awakened and can become part of this new revolutionary society and make political decisions. So the union really tried to first bring domestic workers into its fold. So as we know, most workers in the Soviet Union were employed at enterprises. And so it was much easier for industrial unions to recruit and organize workers than for Narpit, who had to deal with domestic workers working individually in individual homes. So the first challenge for the union was really to walk around and to compile lists of domestic workers and encourage them to come to meetings and become members of the union, which entails, at least paying a small fee. Now, membership in the union wasn't mandatory, so the union really had to do the work of persuasion. And a lot of domestic workers were skeptical. It wasn't necessarily clear to them how they would benefit from being members of the union. They were afraid that their membership in the union could jeopardize their employment, which could be the case. Employers were not particularly thrilled about their domestic workers being members of the union or going to the meetings or demanding times off as they're entitled to according to the law. So in the 1920s, the union really had to work hard to bring in domestic workers because of this constant threat of unemployment. Domestic workers could be easily dismissed for their union membership and then they're replaced with a new woman from a countryside. But overall, I would say the union was successful in at least making domestic workers aware of the union, but also in bringing many of them to the union. Now, domestic workers weren't always very excited about coming to meetings or becoming activists, but I think that initial contact with the union really enabled them to claim their rights if they had a conflict with the employer. So I think that's an important aspect of that. But as for the, other work of the union, not just about protecting the labor rights of domestic workers, the union was really focused on its educational, or I would even say the Enlightenment campaign. So domestic workers who joined the union developed their class consciousness in multiple ways. First of all, the participation in the union meetings, or for those of them who were more kind of inclined to be active, becoming delegates to the union, taking on some sort of union work. That was a major way in awakening their political consciousness. So basically, union delegates would visit other domestic workers, check on their labor conditions. They would participate in meetings, and that was, of course, a kind of a political training that existed within the union. Of course, these delegates were a minority, but for the majority, the union was also a source of enlightenment in a broader sense. Anything from literacy classes to lectures about all aspects from, political lectures, but also, celebrations of revolutionary holidays and developing habits that were more in line with the Soviet ideas of a new Soviet person. All of that was kind of the main kind of part of union work among the broader population of domestic workers. So political work, cultural work, those were all the ways to awaken domestic workers' class consciousness. And there were some things that really appealed to domestic workers. For example, literacy classes were quite popular. We know that the Bolsheviks were overall successful in making the population of at least Soviet Russia literate. Sewing circles were extremely popular among domestic workers because a lot of them saw them as an opportunity to gain a useful skill that will allow them to move out of domestic workers and maybe become independent seamstresses or at least make a nice dress for themselves. Now, of course, the union saw those sewing classes kind of as a hook to bring domestic workers in, and often combined sewing with a political lecture. But overall, there were things that appealed to domestic workers. Another example would be different creative activities, participating in amateur theater, watching plays performed by their peers. But overall, of course, the union was never happy with the level of domestic workers' involvement. And this is true about every union. At the time, the workers were never as politically involved as the Soviet leadership and the union leadership wanted them to. But in the case of domestic workers, there's always this tension between the union, between the idea that domestic workers, there's something fundamentally wrong with them. They're somehow fundamentally backward. And as Marxists would interpret that, probably because of the nature of the labor, but also because they're women, because they're coming predominantly from the countryside. So there is the suspicion that domestic workers are less capable of becoming, truly class conscious. But at the same time, the union had to keep going and to argue for the significance of the work they're doing, and to emphasize that even though the domestic workers are backward now, there is always the promise for them to become conscious Soviet citizens and perhaps eventually even move out of domestic service.
This is a really interesting change, especially that idea of kind of creating the class consciousness by the union. In some ways, this feels like it then extends. You talk about from the late 1930s. It's not just a class consciousness through the union, but that the domestic worker is reimagined as a professional caregiver. How does that kind of happen as a change? And does this actually make any difference? Does it change what it was like to be a domestic worker if it's now called professional caregiver?
That was perhaps the most surprising thing that I found as I was doing research in the archives, those plans to make domestic workers professional caregivers in the 1930s. And to make sense of this, I think it's important to understand the changes that happened in the labor system in the Soviet Union. So we know that at the end of the 1920s, Stalin starts the first 5-year plan, the forced industrialization of Soviet industry that is coupled with collectivization of the countryside. And so as part of this industrialization campaign, women are very actively recruited into the industry. So already by the end, or I would say by 1930, 1931, there is no unemployment in the Soviet Union. In fact, the newly created Soviet industry needs more workers. So the Soviet state really tries to encourage women to join the workforce, to work in production. And very soon, the resources that the country has in the cities are exhausted. So more people are being recruited to come to work in production from the countryside. Now, in this situation, women who had been domestic workers in the cities in the 1920s, most of them end up in production. And a lot of former housewives, women who didn't work before and took on the responsibility for the households, are now also either joining production or becoming politically active. If we're talking about wives of the more privileged members of the society, they would say become members of the wives activist movement. And so as women, urban women, educated women become more engaged in production and in political activism, the problem of housework becomes even more acute. right? There are more women that no longer have the time for housework. But the housework is still not collectivized, although the state does make an effort to introduce collective dining in factories and build childcare centers. But that is never enough. So the more women are being recruited in production, the more acute the question of housework becomes. And this is when the state really becomes concerned about who is going to do the housework. And they are also concerned about the quality of these household services that are available in the Soviet Union. So because there's such a great need for labor in production, domestic workers are no longer particularly concerned about losing the job in domestic service. In fact, there is a real shortage of household workers, and they often would leave their employers for a better paid job in another household, or others would just simply leave employment in domestic service and work in a factory. And so there are a lot of complaints coming from families, and in Soviet press, they're framed really as complaints from mothers and wives who work in production, doctors, engineers, who decry the low quality of services they receive from their domestic workers and their unreliability. So the state, and here I'm referring more to the union, but I think there's also concern within the party. They really try to reimagine domestic workers as professional caregivers who are, contributing to the building of socialism by cooking meals for the workers, so then the next morning they would be ready to go into production and execute the labor feats, for raising Soviet children, really playing an important supportive role in the building of socialism, or as they frame it in the Soviet press, indirectly contributing to production. And so the union develops these elaborate programs for training of domestic workers, and makes plans to have at least half of domestic workers take these courses and pass a special exam to become kind of certified domestic workers. Now, none of that really happens, first of all, because this is a very ambitious plan that is really hard to organize in a situation that most women treat paid domestic labor as a temporary kind of a transitionary job as they arrive from the countryside in the city before they find a better job in production. The best that, as far as I can tell, the best of what the union leadership could get is to have domestic workers attend a couple of lectures. But I think this rhetoric of domestic workers being part of this effort to build socialism, domestic workers contributing to whatever 5-year plan, really elevated the status of paid domestic labor within Soviet society. The Soviet state really took pains to emphasize that paid domestic labor had value in Soviet society. Now, of course, it never brought paid domestic labor up to the level of productive labor. It was still seen as kind of inferior to labor in production. And of course, the reason why these domestic workers were hired is that their employers refused to do housework because they had something better to do. So this tension was never resolved, right? The domestic labor would always occupy the slower position in the hierarchy of labor that's really fundamental in Soviet society. But the shortage of domestic workers and this constant emphasis on their value to the state, I think, really help domestic workers to be more assertive and gave them more leverage in negotiating their relationship with their employers.
This is very interesting to think about, kind of the things you find in the archive and they go, hang on a second, what was actually happening here? Similarly, sort of moving forward in time, if we go to the sort of immediate post-Stalin years, why were questions about domestic work coming to the fore in this moment particularly?
Well, after Stalin's death, we know that Khrushchev tried to reinvigorate the socialist project and kind of move away from the more repressive parts of Stalinist legacy. And an important part of that was addressing the inequalities that existed in Stalinist society, the privileges that members of Soviet elites enjoyed. And financial inequality was a major component of this discussion. So Khrushchev really tries to narrow the salary gap between the kind of the most privileged part of the Soviet society and the workers. And he really encourages unions to talk about these problems of inequality. And domestic service kind of reappears in this discussion again, echoing some of the debates we see in the 1920s about the fundamental inequality that's at the heart of the institution of paid domestic labor. Now, this is something we don't see in the Stalinist era, where you really don't have anyone questioning the existence of paid domestic labor in the Soviet Union in the 30s or 40s. So in the 50s, with this kind of renewed debate about inequality in Soviet society, the persistence of paid domestic labor becomes a point of contentions. If you're familiar with some of the, Khrushchev era comedies, you see a lot of critique of this inequality, and domestic workers would figure out as well. For example, in the comedy Девушка без адреса, A Girl Without an Address, you see a character, a young girl looking for a place in the post-war society, and her job as a domestic worker in a family of a very privileged manager and his wife, who spends her days, going to massages and not really being a productive member of society, is really the critique of this inequality, and one aspect of that inequality, that wealthy people who don't seem to be contributing as much as society have the luxury of not even doing their own dishes because they can afford domestic workers. And so for the first time since the 1920s, we actually see calls for eliminating domestic service in the Soviet Union, or at least banning participation of minors. A lot of domestic workers were teenagers. So there were also calls for restricting employment of underage girls in domestic work, because this is not the right environment to raise the new generation of Soviet citizens. Now, all of that kind of dies out in the late 50s, early 60s, partly because the institution of paid domestic labor dies out as well. And partly because I think the Khrushchev efforts eventually are unsuccessful and he himself loses power. But I think this very last discussion of around paid domestic labor shows that despite all these innovations, I guess, in reimagining paid domestic labor as part of socialist economy, didn't really resolve the tension around it. And a lot of people continued to see employment of paid domestic labor as a sign of privilege, as a manifestation of inequality, what I find very interesting is that in these discussions, which are all focused about class, right? This inequality between the privileged members of the Soviet society and those, less privileged migrants from the countryside who take on jobs in domestic service. So all these discussions are about class. And at the same time, there is no one who is questioning the gender dimension of this inequality. I did not come across any discussion in which the fact that these domestic workers are all women is ever questioned. And I think that's really telling about the way Soviet people thought about housework and really the gendered understanding of society where housework is fundamentally women's work.
Mm-hmm. You've mentioned a few points, kind of sort of innovation or interesting, and obviously there's a number of aspects in which this history is quite unique. What do you think can be learnt sort of more broadly from examining this history of Soviet domestic labor?
Well, I think there are several things we can learn from the history of Soviet domestic labor. First of all, I think it really shows that laws do matter, that domestic workers do better when there's political will to protect their rights, when there are laws, that when there some sort of oversight system that allows them to challenge their employers. And the mere existence of the system constrains employers on what they could do. But at the same time, it also shows the limits of what laws and regulations can do in protecting the rights of domestic workers, because fundamentally, this is something that's happening within the home. And my work, as well as work of other anthropologists who work on domestic service today, is that a lot of negotiations between the employer and the domestic worker are happening within the home. And the law is just one of the leverages that domestic worker could have in this negotiation. And sometimes they would choose to give up some of the things that they're guaranteed by the laws because there's something else that's more valuable to them. For example, domestic workers would often give up things like, weekly days off in exchange for an extended summer vacation when they can spend time with their family in the countryside and help them with their harvest. I think also it shows that at the heart of paid domestic labor lies two types of inequality, gender and class. I think that's pretty obvious for anyone who is studying domestic service. But I also think that it doesn't mean that domestic service has to be fundamentally degrading. Now, in what makes the Soviet society, particularly Soviet society in the 30s and 40s and 50s, peculiar is compared to most other situations where we find widespread paid domestic labor, is that most of these women could find other jobs. They were not constrained to domestic labor. So that really empowered them to negotiate with their employers. But it also meant that those who continued to work in domestic service chose to do that. So paid domestic labor doesn't have to be an occupation of last resort. This is part of a bigger conversation about what we should do with housework. And this is something that we still haven't figured out. And of course, there is no simple solution. There's obviously, the question of gender distribution of labor, the role of technology, and collectivization of housework is something that some feminist thinkers go back to as the way to solve the problem of housework. And I think the Soviet case also shows that even when you do have access to, say, daycare for your children, you won't necessarily choose to do that if you have an option of hiring a nanny who you think would be better for your child than to go into daycare. And I think that the solution is not to eliminate paid domestic labor as a fundamentally exploitative institution, but to think about the ways domestic workers can do their jobs and live dignified lives.
Definitely lots of takeaways from this research. Can I ask what you might be working on now that this big project is done, whether or not you've got another book idea or be working on anything else, anything you want to briefly preview for us?
So right now I'm working on my second book project, which is quite different from this book. I think one thing that I found a little disappointing when I was researching domestic workers is that you don't really get to know them. You know, you talk about domestic workers as this kind of social phenomena. You look at the statistics, you look at isolated cases. So in my current project, I focus more on individuals, and I'm actually looking at what I call the first kind of Soviet generation, the people who were born at the turn of the 20th century, and then came of age with the Soviet state and became actively involved in building socialism, either as party members or educated propagandists, and how after the introduction of, after Khrushchev pension reform in 1956, members of this generation retire and find themselves kind of at a loss of how they can continue contributing to the building of communism, something that they dedicated their life to. So my current project is about retired activists in late Soviet society, and I look at specific individuals and their life trajectories, and I'm hoping that this work will contribute to our understanding of the life course in the Soviet Union, but also give us a different way to examine the role and the power of ideology in late Soviet society. We tend to think of late Soviet society as suffering from this hyper-normalization of the discourse, when the ideology becomes meaningless and kind of hollowed out. And to me, I see that the members of this generation that have been intimately involved in building socialism, ideology by any degree does not lose meaning, and they continue kind of finding ways to be engaged and be active in building socialism.
Well, that sounds like a very interesting next project, so best of luck with that.
Thank you.
In the meantime, of course, listeners can read the book we've been discussing, titled Domestic Service in the Soviet Union, Women's Emancipation and the Gendered Hierarchy of Labour, published by Cambridge University Press in 2024. Alissa, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast to tell us about the book.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for your great questions.